When Rome celebrated victory, thousands of women vanished, not in battle, but into paperwork, markets, and ledgers. Content warning: this video discusses sexual violence, forced captivity, and trafficking. If that is distressing to you, please take care and consider watching later. Picture a dust-choked road outside the city, the sun sliding low over a long column of soldiers. Banners snap in the wind. Trumpets have already given the signal. Amid the measured tread of legionaries, among the spoils and the wagons of silver, there are groups of people who are not trophies of metal, but human beings in chains, and many of them are women. What happened to women captured during Roman triumphs? The short, harsh answer is this: beyond the battlefield's violence, Roman triumphal practice routinely folded captured women into a procedural system of public humiliation, bureaucratic commodification, transport, sale, and enforced labor or sexual servitude. That system is not guesswork. It leaves traces in military reports, fragmentary letters, commercial ledgers, medical treatises, legal records, graffiti, tombstones, and the occasional moralizing note from historians. Those records do not tell a single uniform story for every time and place. They do, however, show a pattern sequence, a ritual and an economy that turned captive women into both public spectacle and taxable property. If you want more investigations into the hidden sides of history like this, subscribe. We'll keep looking where the archives are quiet. Separation: who was taken and who was left. After a city surrendered or was taken by force, the first acts were not always military in the strict sense. Surviving accounts and administrative fragments indicate a process of selection. Able-bodied men of fighting age were often separated first. Some were put to death as an exemplary measure, others were selected for gladiatorial shows or the arena, and some were simply kept as slaves. Children, the elderly, and others outside productivity parameters could be abandoned, eliminated, or enslaved locally depending on local circumstances and commanders' choices. Women, however, were treated with a distinct set of expectations. Rather than being lumped as an undifferentiated category with other captives, the records suggest women were singled out for public exposure. Contemporary narratives, the language used in military and civic correspondence, emphasize their visibility in the victory spectacle, presented on the route of the triumph, displayed for the city to see as a sign both of military success and of domination. This was the opening act of a longer administrative choreography. Ritualized humiliation: the triumph as performance. A Roman triumph, by design, was a theatrical assertion of supremacy. The presence of captive women in its procession made that theatricality intimate and gendered. Sources drawn from military manuals and later historians show that captives could be paraded, inspected, and publicly named as part of the display. The act of displaying women in chains served two overlapping political functions. Firstly, to reassure the citizenry that the enemy had been broken. Secondly, to mark the bodies of those women as evidence of victory, proof that distant towns, peoples, and families had been subdued. That public exposure was not the end. It was the first and most visible stage. Records and later commentaries suggest that officers and officials conducted selections during and immediately after the procession. Some captives were taken into private households of commanders or leading citizens. Others were set apart for sale. Another portion was designated for public markets or state institutions. In some administrative fragments, the designation of captives uses technical terminology, lists, inventories, and terms of assignment, indicating that the display had seamlessly shifted into paperwork and allocation. Visibility gave way to classification. Branding and inventory, marking people as property. One of the most chilling continuities between spectacle and commerce is bureaucratic marking. Surviving administrative records, inventories tied to military units, taxation documents, and even some archaeological inscriptions show that captives could be cataloged in formal lists. In some cases, captives were physically marked to record ownership, branded or tattooed with signs that tied them to a campaign, a legion, or a purchaser. These marks were not symbolic gestures. They functioned as identifiers in a system that considered captives as assets to be tracked, taxed, transferred, and sometimes resold. Ledger fragments and commercial correspondence from port cities make the point bluntly. Women captured in conquest appear in the same columns as other trade items. One cargo ledger from Alexandria, for example, lists human captives alongside wine and horses, an administrative juxtaposition that turns a city's human cost into ledger lines. Where numbers appear in surviving records, a 15,000 figure recorded for a specific sack at Delia, for instance, historians note them as figures in administrative paperwork rather than as uncontestable totals. They remain, nonetheless, evidence of scale as perceived by contemporary record keepers. Transport and attrition, chained marches, ships, and loss. Once catalogued, captives entered the logistics of empire. Military provisioning records, letters from quartermasters, and merchant instructions detail long marches from battlefield to port, the corralling of prisoners into guarded wagons, and shipping arrangements. Captives were sometimes held in temporary warehouses or military depots before being moved en masse to coastal markets or distributed to owners. The transport itself was lethal.
Contemporary economical calculations and shipping accounts allow for expected loss rates during routes, a tacit concession in the paperwork that some captives would die en route. Scholars working from these administrative notes have estimated attrition rates in transit could reach 20 to 30% in some cases. These are not modern estimates alone, but were reflected in the allowances made by those who managed movement and sale. Fewer expected survivors meant different provisioning and different profit calculations. Where individuals survive to tell a tale of that journey, their words are often fragmentary, but the pattern across documents is consistent. Cramped spaces, minimal rations, disease and exhaustion, and an institutional tolerance for mortality that treated loss as a cost of doing business. Markets and institutions, auctions, brothels, temples, and mines. Arrival at port or market did not restore dignity. Auction records, municipal sale notices, and legal fragments indicate that captives, women among them, were brought to market and sold. Auction houses performed medical inspections where buyers checked for physical conditions that would affect value. Some purchasers were private citizens looking to replenish domestic staffs. Others were entrepreneurs buying labor for mines, fields, and ships. Crucially, a portion of captive women were sold into institutions where their bodies would be used for sexual services, brothels. Brothels in Rome and many urban centers were legal and regulated enterprises. They were taxed, and their income often appeared in municipal ledgers. Medical treatises and physicians' notes reference conditions associated with frequent sexual labor, chronic genital infections, hemorrhages, infertility, and other long-term consequences. Saurinus, a physician cited in fragmentary medical writing, records gynecological ailments common among women in such circumstances. These clinical notes become evidence not only of individual suffering, but of an institutionalized pattern of abuse. The market for sexual labor was thus not an extra-legal underside of empire, but a taxable, recorded component of its economy. Not all women were sold into brothels. Some were parceled out to households as domestic servants. Others were transferred to state institutions, temples or public workshops, or to labor camps like mines, where mortality could be brutally high. A few might be granted manumission or escape that fate, but surviving records show those exceptions were rare. Tombstones and epitaphs, when they survive for enslaved women, often record a name granted in a private household and hint at a life ended far from the family and place of origin. Medical and social consequences, bodies and identities marked. The consequences recorded in medical, funerary, and legal documents are multiple.
Physicians' fragments note repeated infections, chronic pain, recurrent bleeding, and infertility among women who had been in brothels or forced labor. Psychological consequences, trauma, despair, suicides, appear in scattered narratives and in legal disputes where desperation is an explanatory factor. Tomb inscriptions sometimes capture a skeletal outline of a life, a name, an age, and the fact of servitude. Graffiti and degraded remains in urban contexts can signal lost identities. Blandina, A striking, fragmentary voice preserved in early Christian martyr accounts is an important, if exceptional, witness. The testimonies that survive her name speak to repeated suffering under multiple forms of cruelty, even as she maintained a religious conviction. Her fragmentary account is not representative in every detail, but it is invaluable precisely because first-person testimony from the enslaved is so rare. Where such testimony exists, it underscores the human costs that numbers and ledgers often flatten. Evidence in the archives: letters, ledgers, and inscriptions. To understand the system, we must face the types of records that reveal it. Military reports and correspondence show decisions about allocation and logistics. A fragmentary letter attributed to a legionary named Marcus Flavius, for instance, mentions the taking of a small number of women, an almost casual line that, in context, reveals how normalized such acquisitions could be for soldiers. Commercial ledgers from port cities list captives alongside trade goods. Municipal tax documents record revenue from brothels and sales. Medical treatises and physician notes describe ailments tied to forced sex work or poor conditions in labor camps. Inscriptions, from epitaphs to carved notations on municipal buildings, occasionally preserve references to branded captives or to the ownership of specific individuals. Pompeii's graffiti shows the cultural texture: coarse jokes, names scrawled over walls, requests for services, evidence that sexual commerce was integrated into everyday urban life and jokingly or crudely remarked upon. The presence of that graffiti does not prove every Roman was complicit. It does, however, signal a social milieu in which sexual exploitation of certain classes of women was normalized and spoken of openly. Case vignettes: glimpses into lives and systems. A few specific records help us to humanize a system otherwise presented as ledger entries. Marcus Flavius's fragmentary letter. This short piece of correspondence, preserved only in fragments, records that the writer had taken 3 women. The tone is detached. The line reads like an administrative note. Its triviality is itself telling. For some combatants, the taking of human captives was recorded with the same ordinary cadence as counting supplies. The Alexandria cargo ledger. An extant ledger from Alexandria survives in fragments and lists various cargoes shipped to the imperial markets.
Among barrels of wine and crates of horses, there are entries indicating human captives. The juxtaposition is stark and makes the economy of conquest literal on the page. Camella's transport calculus. Administrative manuals and logistical correspondence sometimes include calculations about acceptable transport losses. One set of notes, attributed in scholarly discussion to a logistician known in the secondary literature by a name that requires verification in production sources, treats attrition as a predictable line item, with planners factoring in expected deaths when organizing space and supplies. That cold arithmetic makes the system's tolerance for human loss explicit. Saurinus's medical fragments. A Roman physician recorded observations about gynecological conditions among women in brothels and among enslaved laborers. Those clinical entries lend medical corroboration to other documentary traces: repeated infections, chronic conditions, impaired fertility. Blandina. Her testimony, preserved in Martyr Acts, is exceptional. While the literary genre may have shaped her account, the fragments show a woman repeatedly subjected to suffering and humiliation before a legal execution that the author frames as persecution. She is a rare voice from below the social ladder, and scholars rightly treat her testimony carefully. The red-haired one. Accounts of slave rebellions sometimes preserve the names or nicknames of leaders. One such leader, recorded only by a descriptive epithet, the red-haired one, is credited with organizing enslaved women into revolt. The legal aftermath, reflected in court records and local histories, shows a brutal response: exemplary punishment, public executions, and legislation aimed at preventing similar uprisings. The existence of the revolt and the severe repression that followed revealed 2 truths. Even in the brutal confines of bondage, people resisted, and the state responded with violence intended to deter collective action. Dea's 15,000. Administrative tallies attributed to a sack at Dea record a high number of captives, 15,000 women among them in the surviving documents.
Historians treat such totals as indications of how the victors record scale rather than as literal headcounts that can be accepted uncritically. Still, the fact that such a number appears in paperwork points to the scale at which captives could be conceptualized and commodified. Ammianus Marcellinus's echoes. Writing later, Ammianus Marcellinus and other historians recorded episodes where Romans themselves were captured and suffered similar fates under foreign powers. Those observations disrupt triumphant narratives and suggest a cyclical character to the phenomena of capture and commodification. Across these vignettes, a pattern emerges: ritual visibility, bureaucratic processing, commodification, transport, sale, and institutional placement, and the human consequences that follow.
Moral reflection and modern echoes. The historical record is not an indictment of individual Romans in the abstract. It is evidence of a system in which institutions, markets, and social attitudes combined to normalize the commodification of human beings. That normalization has echoes across time. Modern historians and human rights scholars often draw parallels between ancient practices and contemporary systems of wartime sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Those comparisons are not intended to flatten historical difference. They are meant to sharpen our moral awareness that organized power, when coupled with legal and economic structures, can produce predictable harms. We must ask difficult questions. In what ways does civic pride enable the erasure of suffering? How do administrative routines create moral distance from human consequences? How do economies that profit from exploitation maintain social narratives that justify or silence that profit? These questions are uncomfortable because they implicate not only ancient institutions, but the mechanics of any polity that places power and profit above human dignity. What the archives demand of us. The archives, ledgers, letters, medical notes, and fragmentary testimonies do not give us a complete accounting. They do provide a sequence that answers the simple but consequential question: what happened to women captured during Roman triumphs? They were publicly displayed and humiliated as part of the triumphal performance. They were classified, marked, and inventoried as property. They were transported under conditions that accepted mortality as an economic variable. They were sold into households, mines, temples, and brothels, the last of which were regulated and taxed. They suffered physical and psychological harm, with medical notes attested to chronic conditions and high mortality. A few resisted, some revolted. A few left fragmentary testimonies. Most remain the ledger line beneath the spectacle of Rome. Closing reflection and production notes. History is neither pure outrage nor passive cataloging. It is an invitation to see how institutions work and to interpret the moral contours of those workings. The record of what happened to women captured during Roman triumphs is a sober reminder that the monuments we admire often rest on the bones and labor of the vulnerable. To honor those traces requires more than acknowledgement. It requires that modern readers and viewers reckon with the structural mechanisms, legal, economic, and cultural, that made such practices possible. For those producing this material, the claims and names referenced here should be verified against archival sources flagged in the research notes. For example, the Dea Tally, the Marcus Flavius fragment, the Alexandria ledger, Saurinus's medical fragments, the Blandina Acts, Ammianus Marcellinus's passages, Pompeian graffiti, and certain tomb inscriptions.
Some spellings and attributions in older secondary discussions need confirmation. Please verify names and Latin terms in primary editions before publication. Share this if you think these hidden costs of empire deserve public attention. If you want a deeper dive into primary documents and the scholarship that pieces them together, watch our linked playlist on ancient violence and archival traces. And most importantly, keep asking the uncomfortable questions. History asks us to remember those whose faces do not appear on statues, and to reckon with what that remembering will require.